Some of you all remember the prophetic genius of a gentleman by the name of John Coltrane. Married the melancholy meter of the blues to the restrained joy of the spiritual, then mixed urban patterns of northern gospel and gave birth to a love supreme, giant steps, and my favorite things through his saxophone. Coltrane undeniably was a genius, but secretly a drug addict. He was gifted, but he had issues. Or maybe you remember the blues-inspired social comedic commentary of a man by the name of Richard Pryor, who blended the African griot tradition with the literary trickster paradigm and created a brand of comedy that would cause the listener to laugh, cringe, and at moments cry. Richard Pryor, no doubt, was a brilliant comedic soul, but he was raised in a horror house and struggled with drug abuse. He was gifted, but he had issues. Maybe you remember the grand purveyor of socially conscious soul by the name of Marvin Gaye, whose music blends the beauty of the black church with the southern urban rhythms and asks the fundamental question, what's going on? He told the world about police brutality to the point that it makes you want to holler and throw up both your hands. The true poet of soul music, but he was shot dead by his father. He was gifted, but he had issues. Or maybe you remember the silky, honey-dipped voice of a gentleman by the name of Donny Hathaway, whose tenor tonality could make a sister tremble and scream and a brother jealous with envy. With all his talent and popularity, he fought his own demons and eventually took his own life. He was gifted, but he had issues. It is true, we are sitting upon these pews as a great people, but limited by our issues. Issues swirl around our spirit and secrets hide in the closet of our hearts. No one, no matter how gifted, can be completely released from their limitations. All of us have issues. My issues may not be your issues, but everybody in this place has issues. Matter of fact, all God's children got issues. You may try to act like you ain't got no issues. I know you want to come to church and look so good, but beneath the veneer of your fashion sense, there are some issues that are chasing you down in your own home. It is human nature for us to overcompensate for our limitations. The athlete with skill and ability, head and shoulders above everyone on the field. But as soon as some come off the field, you find a person of insecurity and operates as an adolescent. The brilliant music of someone whose compositions boggle the mind and bring people to their feet can be a social misfit once the lights go off and they are removed from the stage. Maybe a visionary CEO or a compassionate leader becomes a cruel tyrant to his family once he leaves the office. We all have limitations, and everyone is afflicted with a democratically communicable disease known as issues. We all have issues. Your issues may not be my issues, but nonetheless, we all have issues. Go with me for a moment as we look at this particular text. The trouble inherent in this word is the framing of Jesus by Mark. Mark is a man committed to liberating. Mark is a man committed to the liberation perspective of Jesus. And Jesus is a person who is committed to liberating us from our limitations. But his commitment to liberation causes conflict. Mark frames Jesus as a revolutionary activist, Carmen, who is seeking to subvert authority and the status quo. It is author Chad Myers who frames it this way, that the Gospel of Mark is about a direct action campaign, that Jesus in many ways is trying to take over the church, the synagogue that had been co-opted by Rome. If I may give some history to give some background, just go with me for a moment here. Palestine was under Roman control. It became under Roman control in 63 BC. BCE. The only formidable power that could defeat Rome was the Parthian Empire, or better known as the Persian Empire. Palestine was the buffer between the Persian Empire, what is today known as Iraq. And so it was Rome that had to invest in colonizing Palestine because they did not want anyone to have access to the Mediterranean Sea. And so Palestine, what we know as Jerusalem, what we know as Galilee, was co-opted by Rome because it was important militarily to make sure that the Persians did not make their way to Rome. The Persian Empire, called Iran today. Palestine gave them control over the Mediterranean Sea, that is for Rome, protecting the empire from any naval invasion from the east. Control of Palestine was essential to Roman society and sovereignty. The way to control Palestine was through the synagogue. The lifeblood of the community was in the synagogue, and if the preacher/priest were under Roman influence, it guaranteed suppression of any revolt. Previous revolts in the Jewish community were religious in nature. Matthias and Judas Maccabee organized a guerrilla campaign against the Persians, and they released themselves from the lash of oppression, but then Rome came and occupied them in 63 BCE. Rome, in order to keep another revolt from occurring, co-opted the temple with conservative priests, loyal to Rome over the Jewish community. The priests were paid and given status in the empire. They became overseers and were appointed to positions and given privilege over other Jewish people. Worship ceased to be about holistic encounters with God, but became a ritual focusing on spiritual actions disconnected from life. Being a good Jew was no longer serving God, but being a good Jew was being a docile Jew, a Jew who was a credit to this race, that they would scratch when they did not itch and shuffle in front of Roman authority so that they could receive status over someone else. And they would do anything they could to make sure that anyone who threatened the status quo was put down. Sounds familiar. The priest never got up in the pulpit and criticized the government, never questioned a policy, never questioned the power structure, never raised questions about poverty, never talked about violence, never talked about economic distribution, never uttered a word about love and justice. The priest only preached about personal sin. This emphasis on personal sin or personal piety changed the theology of the community. People spent time focusing on personal issues. Who was sleeping with who, what diet they were having, what they were eating, if it was clean or unclean, and gave rise to what I call a theology of holiness. Come on with me. Anyone displaying any physical ailment, blemish, or defect was defined as sinful. The body became the template of determining if God was punishing or rewarding an individual. The body became a theological commodity. Since my theology is only personal, I do not examine the work of God holistically, but through the lens of the body and the material possession gained through work. My view of God is now reduced to biological determinism and physical materialism. If my body has a defect, I'm sinful. If I'm poor, it means I lack faith. If I have no children, it means I'm cursed, because my priest only focuses on personal piety and personal sin and will never raise a question about what happens in the world. So therefore, my theology points inward, meaning that I am in the condition that I am is because I didn't pray enough or don't have the proper relationship with God. But I stopped by here to let you know that there was somebody walking into the synagogue. You see here, the faith of liberation became the religion of subjugation. The synagogue, the place of culture, faith, and empowerment, became the home of personal piety and social control. But God, but God, Jesus enters the synagogue without a seminary degree, without ordination, in-care status, or a dual standing. Jesus comes into the synagogue and says, I'm turning this thing around. This is my Father's house, and you've turned it over to Caesar. Caesar didn't create the world. Caesar does not hold the universe in his hands, and I'm about to take over the synagogue and let you know what my Father has in store for God's people. And here you have Jesus in the synagogue. And there is a man in this synagogue with diminished capacity. He's in church, but there is no healing. He's been coming to church year after year, week after week, day after day, and there is no healing. He was no longer expecting healing to take place. He figured that his shriveled, diminished capacity was normative, even though it was dysfunctional. He thought his dysfunctionality was functional and normative. And so my issues and limitations are not signs of my lack of faith, instead of the fact that it just happens to be a cosmic coincidence that I have an issue in my life. I'm no longer expecting healing. I'm comfortable with my diminished capacity. And so often within the church, people come week after week and day after day, year after year. You're not expecting a healing. You are just simply going through the motion of a ritual. But here is Jesus saying, when you go to worship, you should expect something to happen. When you go to worship, you should expect a healing to take place. Don't just come up in here to hear the choir. Don't just come up in here to hear some prayers. Don't just come up here to see your friends. When you walk through these doors, you should expect something to happen in your life. If nobody else expects it, you should expect it. If God woke you up this morning, you need to step out of your door and say, I'm making it to God's house because I expect a blessing and I expect some healing. Is there anyone in here? You showed up today because you expect some healing to take place in church, and no healing. It was comfortable, Reverend Linda, with limited capacity, with diminished capacity. But look at the text. I just want to teach this for a minute here. Within the text, Jesus comes in, Reverend Jacobs, comes in, and already the self-appointed committee is ready to accuse him, because Jesus is disturbing the status quo, because their power was rooted in making sure things do not change. Comfortable with the status quo. Change means I lose my power, and it forces me to shift my theology. Because my theology has been, when I look at you and see diminished capacity, I feel better about myself. Because in reality, I'm really insecure. That's why I have to get a committee of people to talk about you. Because when I talk about you, I feel better about myself. But Jesus is coming to change all of that, to say that when you come into God's house, that there should be some healing that's taking place. And you have to be careful of a spirit that operates in such a way that they feel that they can rise when they see your demise. I'm here to let you know that God never ordered anything with an either or Western paradigm, because in the West, it's always either either or. If you do well, I do bad. That's not the way our God rolls. Our God says, guess what? You can be uplifted and I can be excited for your blessing at the same time. That when you are blessed, I am blessed. And I don't know if there's anyone in here that you can be excited not for what God has done for you, but what God has done for somebody else. Because when Jesus is blessing your neighbor, it just means he's in the neighborhood.